The moment Benjamin Sutton pushed open the front door of his ranch house and heard nothing, not the clatter of a pan, not the soft hum of Jane's voice, not even the lazy scratch of the old hound against the floorboards, he knew in his bones that something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. He stood in the doorway of the small clapboard house he had built with his own 2 hands in the hill country of central Texas, the year being 1873, and the late October wind pressed at his back like something trying to push him forward into a truth he was not ready to face. The fire in the hearth had burned down to gray ash. The supper table was bare. Jane's blue shawl, the one she draped over the chair back every single evening without fail, was gone. Benjamin set his saddlebag down on the porch step with a heaviness that had nothing to do with its weight. He crossed the threshold and walked through the parlor, his boot heels loud against the planked floor, the sound ricocheting off walls that felt strange and hollow. He checked the bedroom. The wardrobe door stood open, and most of her dresses were missing, though not all of them, which confused him in a way that hurt more than if she had taken everything. Like she had left in a hurry, like she had not entirely made up her mind but had gone anyway. It was on the kitchen table that he found the note, a single folded sheet of paper anchored beneath the salt cellar. His name was written on the outside in Jane's careful, slanted hand, each letter deliberate the way everything she did was deliberate. He stared at it for a long moment before he picked it up, turning it over slowly, as if buying a few more seconds of not knowing could somehow change what was inside. He unfolded it. Benjamin, I cannot keep pretending that staying here is the same as being alive. I have tried. Lord knows I have tried. But you have been gone more days than you have been home these past 2 years, and the loneliness has become something I cannot carry anymore. I do not blame you for who you are, I never could, but I am not strong enough to be the woman who waits forever. I am going to my sister in New Mexico territory. Please do not come after me. It would only make it harder. Take care of yourself. Always, Jane. Benjamin read it twice, then a third time. He set it back on the table with the deliberate care of a man handling something fragile, though the paper itself was just paper, and sat down heavily in the chair that had always been his at the head of the table. He pressed his palms flat on the tabletop and stared at the wood grain and breathed. She had gone to her sister, Clara Norris, Clara Webb now, after she had married a land surveyor named Thomas Webb, lived somewhere near Santa Fe in the New Mexico territory. That was roughly 400 miles from where Benjamin was sitting, as the crow flies, across some of the most unforgiving country in the American Southwest. 4 states of distance between him and the woman he loved, if you counted generously. Texas to New Mexico, but the route would take him through territory that had a way of chewing up careless men and spitting out their boots. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after dark fell. He thought about all the evenings he had ridden back toward this house after long weeks driving cattle north or tracking down strays along the Llano Estacado, and the sight of lamplight in the window had been the only thing keeping him in the saddle. He thought about the way Jane laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind, but the one that started somewhere deep and came out surprised, like she had not expected to be that happy. He thought about the morning 3 years ago when she had stood beside him in the small Baptist church in Harwood, with her dark hair pinned up and her eyes steady on his face, and said the words that he had believed with everything in him meant forever. He had believed them. He still believed them. What he had not understood clearly enough until this moment was that forever required presence. It required showing up, and he had failed at showing up in ways he had not recognized as failure until he was sitting in a cold, dark kitchen reading the evidence of his absence in his wife's handwriting. Benjamin rose from the chair. He went to the bedroom and pulled his traveling kit from the top shelf of the wardrobe. He packed with efficient, purposeful hands, selecting things for the trail and leaving behind things that would not serve him. He took the extra revolver from the lockbox under the bed. He took the leather pouch with the emergency money he kept folded beneath a false board in the wardrobe floor. He took the small photograph of himself and Jane taken on their wedding day in Bastrop, which he kept in the inner breast pocket of his good coat, and he tucked it carefully into the front pocket of his traveling vest, close to his chest. He went to the barn and saddled Cannonball, his blue roan gelding, a deep-chested animal of 14 years that had carried him through weather and wilderness without complaint. He packed the saddlebags with grain and jerked beef and hardtack and a bedroll. He filled both canteens at the well. He told himself he would sleep first, start fresh at dawn. Then he led Cannonball out of the barn, looked at the black sky burning with stars, and swung up into the saddle. He rode west. The first day took him out of the hill country and into the drier brush land of western Texas, the terrain flattening and widening around him as the live oaks gave way to mesquite, and the sky became enormous overhead. The October heat in this part of the country was still formidable during the day, the kind that pressed down from above and radiated up from the pale earth simultaneously. But the nights were cold and crisp, carrying the first real bite of what would eventually become winter. Benjamin pushed Cannonball at a pace that was steady but not brutal. He had ridden hard enough in his life to know that killing a horse in the first 2 days served no one. The gelding settled into a long, rocking trot that ate up the miles without complaint, and Benjamin sat loose in the saddle and let his mind work. He replayed the note. He replayed the past 2 years. He was honest with himself in the way that men are sometimes only honest when there is no one else around, no audience, no need to manage what they reveal. He had taken contracts that kept him away from the ranch for weeks at a time. He had told himself it was necessary, that they needed the money, that the ranch demanded it. Some of that was true, but some of it was something else, something he was less comfortable examining, a restlessness that he had never quite cured, a habit of motion that had been bred into him by a life spent on the move before Jane, and that had not fully been replaced by the stillness she offered. He had loved her. He still loved her. That was not in question. The question was whether love alone was enough of an argument, whether he could ask her to come back without also offering something different, something changed. Whether he could look her in the eye and tell her that the man who came home to an empty house was not the same man who had ridden away all those times. He was not sure yet that it was true, but he was going to ride until he figured it out, and then he was going to tell her. The second day brought him through a stretch of country where the land cracked and heaved like old bread, arroyos cutting through the pale caliche in jagged lines. He followed a rough trail west, stopping at midday to water Cannonball at a sluggish creek that ran brown with silt. While the horse drank, he sat on a flat rock and ate jerked beef and looked at the photograph. Jane was 24 in the photograph, her hair darker than the portrait quality quite captured, her eyes holding that expression she always wore in formal situations, a kind of composed patience, as if she were waiting for the pomp to be over so she could get back to something real. She was beautiful in the way that honest women are beautiful, not arranged for the viewer, not performing, just herself, which was more than enough. More than enough. He had never once looked at her and thought otherwise. What he had done was fail to tell her that, fail to be there to tell her that. He folded the photograph carefully and put it back. On the afternoon of the third day, riding through the broken country east of the Pecos River, he encountered a man by the name of Arlo Tuck, a weathered, sun-darkened fellow of about 45 who was wrestling with a wagon wheel that had cracked its spoke in a rut. Arlo had a broad, honest face and a beard the color of iron shavings, and he accepted Benjamin's help with the wheel with the matter-of-fact gratitude of a man who had learned to take assistance when it was offered without excessive ceremony. They worked the wheel between them, Benjamin holding the axle lifted while Arlo hammered a makeshift wedge into the cracked spoke to stabilize it for travel. It was hard, dirty work in the afternoon heat, and they were both sweating freely by the time it was done. Arlo offered Benjamin water from his barrel and Benjamin accepted. They stood at the side of the wagon in the thin shade of a mesquite thicket, and Arlo asked where he was headed. New Mexico Territory, Benjamin said. Santa Fe area. Arlo nodded slowly, studying the western horizon with eyes that had spent decades reading country. You got family out there? My wife. Arlo looked at him sideways. There was a pause in which the older man quite clearly read the situation in a way that only people who have lived long enough and paid attention can. She go ahead of you? Arlo asked. She went without me, Benjamin said plainly. Arlo was quiet for a moment. Well, he said finally, I suppose that earns a man a long ride. That it does. Arlo gave him what information he had about the trail ahead. He warned him about the stretch past the Pecos where water sources got sparse and unreliable, told him about a trading post at a place called Horsehead Crossing where he could resupply, and mentioned that the mountain passes above Santa Fe could throw early snow in November, which was coming fast. You plan to be back before winter? Arlo asked. I plan to not be going back without her, Benjamin said. Arlo nodded again with an expression that was entirely unreadable, then extended his hand. Benjamin shook it, swung up onto Cannonball, and continued west. The Pecos crossing, when he reached it 2 days later, was as ornery as its reputation. The river ran shallow in October, but the banks on either side were deep, sucking mud that grabbed at Cannonball's legs and made the horse snort with indignation. They crossed slowly, Benjamin standing in the stirrups with his saddlebags and bedroll lifted, the water cold and brown around the horse's barrel. They came out the other side with mud to the knee, and Benjamin dismounted and scraped the worst of it off the horse's legs with a stick and let him rest while he ate the last of his jerked beef and watched the sun sink toward the flat rim of the western desert. He was in New Mexico Territory now, technically. The border was a surveyor's line through an unchanging landscape, but he registered it. He was closer. He camped that night beside a low-cut bank where the wind could not reach him, and the temperature dropped sharply after midnight, the cold coming down from the north like a curtain being pulled across the sky. He pulled his bedroll tight and lay on his back looking at the stars, which were extraordinary out here, blazing and close and indifferent to human trouble. He thought about the first time he had really talked to Jane Norris. It had been at a church social in Harwood, the summer of 1869. He had been 27 at the time, she had been 21, and he had been fresh off a cattle drive that had taken him as far north as Abilene and back. He had been lean and sun-cracked, and not particularly disposed to socializing, but his friend Dale Hutchins had dragged him along on the grounds that a man needed something other than cattle and trail dust in his life. He had been standing at the edge of the gathering with a cup of lemonade feeling out of place when he heard a voice behind him say, with great precision and conviction, "That is completely incorrect." He had turned around to find Jane Norris holding her own cup of lemonade and correcting a man twice her age about the proper crop rotation for hill country soil. She had been entirely right, as he would learn was her habit. He had laughed. She had glanced at him, still mid-argument, caught his eye for just a second, and there had been something immediate and recognizing in it, like two people who have been corresponding for years suddenly meeting in person. He had introduced himself afterward. She had been warm but not foolish about it, interested but assessing, the kind of woman who did not give attention without earning the right to trust the person who received it. He had liked that very much. He had liked everything about her, the way she spoke, the way she thought, the way she moved through the world with a quietness that was not timidity but its opposite. He had courted her for nearly a year. He had been careful about it, deliberate, because he understood she was worth being deliberate about. He had taken time away from the drives to come back to Harwood and call on her. Her father, a hard-edged man named Vernon Norris who ran a small hardware concern, had looked at Benjamin with the frank suspicion of a man who has seen cowboys come and go and has no particular faith in their staying power. Benjamin had understood that suspicion and had worked against it patiently. Vernon Norris had given his blessing in the spring of 1870, saying only, "If you make her unhappy, We will have a conversation about it," which Benjamin had accepted as fair terms. They had been married in May of 1870 and moved to the ranch in the hill country, which Benjamin had been building up for 3 years by then, 40 acres with a good well and a creek that ran clear most of the year. Jane had thrown herself into the life of it with the full-bodied commitment she brought to everything. She had planted a kitchen garden. She had established routines and made the small house into something that felt entirely different from the structure Benjamin had been living in alone. She had brought warmth to the rooms in a way that had nothing to do with the fireplace. And then the cattle business had pressed in. He had taken more contracts. The drives had gotten longer. The weeks away had accumulated. He had not seen it happening. Or perhaps more accurately, he had seen it and told himself that she understood, that she was strong enough, that she knew who she had married and what the life required. He had confused her patience with contentment and her silence with acceptance. He had been wrong. He fell asleep thinking about her eyes in the photograph. The next morning he rode into a small settlement called Cerro Blanco, barely more than a trading post, and a cluster of adobe buildings set against a rise of white rock. He resupplied his provisions, traded for a better map of the country between him and Santa Fe, and let Cannonball rest and feed for several hours while he sat in the shade of the trading post's overhang and talked to the man who ran it, a compact, copper-skinned New Mexican of about 50 named Esteban Reyes, who had lived in this country his whole life and knew every trail in 100 miles. Esteban looked at the map Benjamin had and shook his head gently. "This map is wrong in 3 places," he said, tapping the paper. "These trails do not go where this shows, and this water here, this is dry in October, has been dry for years." Benjamin accepted the corrections gratefully, and Esteban redrew the relevant sections in the margins with a stub of pencil, adding waypoints and water sources from memory with the confidence of a man who has not needed a written map for decades. "You go to Santa Fe?" Esteban asked. "Close to it, looking for a family named Webb, Thomas and Clara Webb." Esteban thought for a moment. "Webb, the surveyor, he has land near Galisteo, I think. South of Santa Fe, maybe 20 miles. Benjamin straightened. "You know him?" "I know of him, I have not met him. He is newer to the territory, maybe 2 years. Esteban shrugged. "It is not a large country, the people in it." This was better information than Benjamin had expected. He had planned to reach Santa Fe and begin inquiring, which could have taken days. Galisteo was specific. He thanked Esteban with genuine feeling and left a fair price for the supplies, which Esteban accepted without ceremony. He pushed hard the next 2 days. The country was opening up into high desert now, the land rising toward the mountains visible on the northern horizon, a long dark wall of blue-black peaks capped with what might have been cloud or might have been early snow. The air was drier and thinner at this elevation, and smelled of juniper and sage, clean and sharp, a world away from the damp heat of the hill country. On the 6th day of riding, he came down off a long, sloping mesa into the valley of the Rio Grande, crossing the river at a shallow ford below the town of Albuquerque. He could see the town's low roofline and the old church tower from the crossing and considered stopping, then decided against it. He was close enough to feel the difference. The distance that had seemed abstract when he read the note in his cold kitchen had collapsed to something nearly tangible, a day's ride, perhaps a day and a half. He spent that night on the south bank of the Galisteo Creek, a night so cold that ice crusted the edges of the still water by morning, the first hard frost of the year crackling under his boots when he rose and saddled the horse in the thin blue light before dawn. Cannonball was tired but sound, still eating well and carrying himself with dignity, and Benjamin spoke to him softly while he tightened the cinch, telling him they were nearly there, which was as much for his own benefit as the horse's. He followed the creek east in the early morning, the country around him a mix of piñon pine and open grassland, the mountains to the north pink and gold in the early light. It was beautiful country in a severe, elemental way, the kind of landscape that does not offer comfort but offers honesty, every feature of it visible and unadorned. He saw the Webb homestead before noon. It sat in a wide, grassy draw fed by a side creek, a sturdier house than he had expected, adobe construction with a good metal roof and a proper porch, a barn and several outbuildings, a kitchen garden that had been more recently tended than Jane's note would have suggested. There were chickens in the yard. Smoke came from the chimney in a thin, straight column. Benjamin pulled up Cannonball on a low rise above the draw and sat there for a long moment, his heart working in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. He was afraid. He recognized it clearly, without self-deception. He was afraid that she would see him coming and feel nothing but the same exhausted sorrow that had made her leave. He was afraid that the words he had been composing in his head for 6 days would turn out to be insufficient. He was afraid that love, even genuine love, was not always enough to repair what neglect had worn away. Then he touched his boot heel lightly to Cannonball's flank and rode down toward the house. He was 50 yards from the porch when the front door opened and a woman came out, small and fair-haired, wiping her hands on an apron. Clara Webb looked at the approaching rider with the cautious assessment of a woman alone on a homestead in territory that was not yet fully tamed, and then her expression shifted as she recognized him. She stepped off the porch and stood with her arms folded, her eyes steady on his face. "Benjamin Sutton," she said when he reined up. "Clara." He tipped his hat. "Is she here?" Clara's expression was complicated, carrying both an approval and a guardedness that he understood. She was protecting her sister as she should be. "She is here," Clara said. "She is not expecting you. I know she is not. She told you not to come." "Yes." Clara studied him for a long moment. Then she said, "She is down at the creek. She goes there in the mornings." She paused. "Benjamin, if you are here to drag her back without offering her anything worth going back for, I will ask you to leave right now." "I am not here to drag her anywhere," he said. "I am here to tell her the truth if she will listen. The rest is her choice." Clara held his gaze for another second, then stepped aside and pointed south along the creek. 20 minutes walk. There is a cottonwood leaning over the water. She likes to sit there. He tied Cannonball to the porch rail, removed his hat and hung it on the saddle horn and walked. The creek was clear here, running over smooth pale stones. The cottonwood Clara had described visible from 50 yards away, its remaining leaves burning gold and trembling in a light breeze. He saw Jane before she saw him. She was sitting on a flat rock at the water's edge with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, her dark hair loose down her back, looking at the water. She was wearing a plain gray dress and a brown wool jacket he had not seen before, something she must have acquired recently. She looked, from a distance, very still. Not sad exactly, or at least he could not see sadness from here, only stillness, the way a person looks when they have stopped fighting something and are just being with it. He was 10 steps away when she heard him. He saw her go rigid before she turned, the way a person does when they hear something unexpected in a place they thought was private. Then she turned. Her face did several things in rapid succession. Shock, certainly. Then something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, a kind of defensive bracing. Then something else underneath both of those things, something that she covered quickly, that she had practice covering. He stopped walking. They looked at each other across about 8 feet of creek bank, the water moving between them. "You rode out here," she said. Her voice was even, but he knew her voice well enough to hear everything in it. "I did. I asked you not to. I know. I am sorry for not honoring that, but I could not stay in that house and read that note and just accept it. I needed to see you." Jane unfolded herself from the rock and stood, not moving closer, her arms crossed now, a posture he recognized as the armor she put on when she was trying not to let him see too much. "What is there to see, Benjamin?" she said. "I told you what I needed to tell you. I was not cruel about it. I was honest." "You were honest," he agreed. "The note was honest. That is not what I am arguing." "Then what are you arguing?" He took a breath. He had rehearsed this, and now all of it fell away from him and left him with just the plain, unpolished truth. "That I was wrong," he said. "Not about loving you. I was not wrong about that. But about the shape of the life I was offering you. I told myself that providing for the ranch was the same thing as being present for you, and it was not the same thing. It was never the same thing. I knew that somewhere under everything, but I did not let myself look at it directly, and you paid the price for that. Jane was very still. I left you alone too many times, he said. I came home and found you there and took comfort in that without thinking about the cost to you of being the one always waiting. You told me more than once, in the way you tell a person things when you are not sure they are listening, and I did not hear it clearly enough to change. I am sorry for that, Jane. I am sorry for all of it. The water ran over the stones. A crow called somewhere upstream and fell silent. You rode how far? She said at last. 6 days, roughly 400 miles. Something moved in her eyes behind the armor. 6 days, she repeated softly. I would have ridden to the Pacific if that is where you had gone. She looked away from him, out at the water, and he could see her working through something, turning it over, testing it the way you test old wood before you put your weight on it. Saying you are sorry is not the same as being different, she said. No, it is not. You are right. Then what are you actually offering me, Benjamin? What is different? You love the cattle business. You love the open country. You love being in motion. That is who you are. I married who you are. I never wanted to change that. I just could not keep being the empty space you came back to fill for a few days before leaving again. He took a step toward her, then stopped because this was not the moment to close the distance physically. This was the moment to earn it. I have been thinking about this for 6 days, he said. Riding 6 days by yourself through empty country gives you a lot of time to look at things clearly. I do not want to stop ranching, but I can change how I work. I can take fewer contracts. I can hire another hand so I am not riding out for weeks at a time. I can come home at night. The drives to Abilene, I can hire those out. Other men take those contracts. There is no law that says it has to be me leading everyone. He paused, and I should have told you. Every single day, in ways that were real and not just assumed, I should have told you that you are the most important thing in my life. Not the ranch, not the cattle, you. Jane turned back to him. Her eyes were bright, though she had not cried. She had the expression she wore when she was thinking something she was not sure she should say, the slight tension at the corner of her mouth, the steadiness of her gaze. You rode 6 days, she said again, and this time it was less a statement than a question about its own meaning. I would ride 60, he said simply. A long pause. The cottonwood leaves trembled and a few fell into the water and drifted away. I do not know if I can just go back to that house and have everything be the same, she said quietly. It will not be the same. I will make sure it is not. Words are easy, Benjamin. They are, which is why I am also telling you that if you need more time or if you want to stay here with Clara for a while, I will wait. I'm not trying to rush you or tell you what to feel. I'm just asking for the chance to show you that I mean what I say, however long that takes. She looked at him for a very long time with those dark, serious eyes that had seen through every performance he had ever attempted, and had loved him anyway, which was the most remarkable thing he could think of about her. Then something in her face shifted. The armor did not exactly fall, but something behind it opened, something cautious and hopeful and frightened all at once, and it was the most honest expression he had seen from her in years, which told him how long she had been keeping it locked away. You look terrible, she said, and her voice had changed, the careful flatness of it softening into something he recognized. 6 days on the trail, and you did not think to find a barber at any point. He ran a hand over his jaw, which had accumulated a considerable quantity of dark beard. I was in somewhat of a hurry. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the country immediately bordering one. Clara will have coffee, she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a reconciliation. It was just an invitation back toward the house, and Benjamin Sutton understood it for exactly what it was, a door that was not closed. He walked beside her. They walked up the creek bank in silence, not touching, the space between them careful but not hostile. He was acutely aware of her, of the sound of her footsteps on the dry grass, of the way she held her jacket closed against the breeze. 3 years of marriage had taught him her physical language so completely that he could read her mood in the set of her shoulders, and what he read now was something fragile and provisional. A woman who had gathered herself up and was considering, very carefully, whether to set anything back down. Clara was on the porch when they came back into sight of the house. She looked at them both with sharp eyes that catalogued the distance between them and whatever expression their faces carried. And then she turned and went inside without comment, which was, Benjamin suspected, the most tactful thing Clara Webb had ever done in her life. Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and cornbread, and there was a man at the table who rose when they came in, Thomas Webb, Clara's husband, a fair-haired, calm-faced man of about 35 who shook Benjamin's hand with the firm, uncomplicated grip of a fellow who had done enough physical work in his life to respect it in others. He said he was glad Benjamin had made the ride and meant it straightforwardly, and then he took his coffee to the other room with a tact that matched his wife's. Clara poured coffee and set it in front of Benjamin without ceremony and put a plate of cornbread on the table. Benjamin drank the coffee, which was strong and very good, and felt the accumulated exhaustion of 6 days riding settling into his muscles now that he had stopped moving. Jane sat across the table from him and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at the steam rising from it. "How did you know where to find me?" she asked. "Your note said you were coming to your sister. I knew Clara and Thomas were in New Mexico. Finding the exact location took some asking." "You rode 4 states," she said. "Texas and then New Mexico territory, that is 2. The note said 4, he smiled slightly. "I may have exaggerated the geography in my head, it felt like 4. That almost smile at the corner of her mouth again. He lived for it. They talked through the morning and into the afternoon, the conversation moving carefully at first, like stepping on ice to test the thickness, and then gradually with more ease. He told her about the ride, about Arlo Tuck and the wagon wheel, about Esteban Reyes and the corrected map. She asked questions, specific ones, the kind of questions she always asked, interested in the details of things rather than just the outline. He told her about crossing the Picos and about the cold nights and about lying on his back looking at the stars on the south bank of the Galisteo Creek. She told him about the weeks since she had left, about how the decision had not been impulsive, that she had been turning it over for months, that the morning she had finally done it had been an ordinary morning, just another in a long sequence of ordinary mornings alone, and something had simply given way inside her, quietly, without drama, like a joint that has been under pressure for too long finally separating. She had packed what she could carry and written the note and ridden to the Harwood Stage Depot and bought a ticket without letting herself think too much, because thinking too much would have made her stay, and she had known that staying, without something changing, would eventually do a damage to her that she could not come back from. He listened to all of this without interrupting. He listened to it with the full, absolute attention he had not given her enough of over the past 2 years, and he thought that this, simply this, attentiveness and presence was the beginning of what he was trying to offer her. "Are you happy here?" he asked when she had finished. He meant it genuinely. He needed to know that this was not solely about the ranch, that there was not a part of her that simply preferred this life, this country, this distance from the life they had built. Jane considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "I am comfortable here," she said. "Clara is a good companion. Thomas is a decent man. The country is different from what I am used to, but I find I like it." A pause. "But this is not my home, Benjamin. This is my refuge. There is a difference." He understood. "And do you still—" he started. "Yes," she said before he could finish. The word was quiet but unambiguous, and it landed in his chest like something fitting back into a place it had been taken from. He reached across the table slowly and laid his hand palm up on the wood between them. An offer, not a demand. He watched her look at it for a moment, and then she put her hand in his. They sat like that for a while, neither of them speaking, and outside the window the high desert afternoon was bright and still, the mountains standing blue against the sky in the distance. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at the situation, said, "I am going to start supper," and retreated with a small, private smile. Thomas Webb's voice drifted from the other room, talking to himself or his papers, doing the careful cartographic work that was his trade, and Benjamin thought that he liked this household. He liked the steadiness of it, the sense that the people in it had made real choices and were living by them. Over supper the four of them talked, and Benjamin found himself drawn into the conversation about the land survey Thomas was completing, a boundary determination for several adjoining properties that had been generating dispute for years. Thomas was precise and thoughtful about his work, careful with facts, careful with the human implications of boundary lines in a part of the world where ownership was still being contested in ways that had long histories and complex grievances. He acknowledged without prompting that a great deal of the land being surveyed had belonged to Mexican and Pueblo communities long before American arrival, and that the legal structures now being imposed on it were imperfect at best and unjust at worst. Benjamin respected him for saying it plainly. It was the kind of thing many men in the territory chose not to look at directly. Jane listened to this conversation and occasionally added her own thoughts, and Benjamin watched her across the table and saw what he had always known, that she was sharper and more engaged with the world than the quiet exterior suggested, that her mind was always working, that she needed a life in which that mind was engaged and respected. He had known that when he married her. He had not always remembered it when he was away. After supper, Clara sent the men to sit on the porch while she and Jane cleaned up, and Benjamin sat in a wooden chair with a second cup of coffee and looked at the stars coming out above the pinon pines and thought about what came next. Thomas sat beside him in comfortable silence for a while, then said, "She is a remarkable woman, Jane. I want you to know that I think you are worth the second chance she is considering giving you. But I am telling you clearly, if you come back out here in a year with the same reasons, I will tell you to your face that you do not deserve her." "You would be right," Benjamin said. Thomas nodded once as if that was sufficient. Benjamin stayed 3 days at the Webb homestead. He slept in the barn, which he offered to do himself without being asked, understanding that certain proprieties needed to be observed, and that asking to sleep under the same roof as his wife when they were in the middle of rebuilding something was not a conversation worth having. The barn was clean and warm with the body heat of the animals, and he slept better on the straw than he had on the trail, exhaustion finally claiming him fully. In those 3 days he and Jane talked more than they had in perhaps the last year of their marriage combined. They walked in the mornings along the creek. They sat on the porch in the evenings. They talked about the ranch, about what they both actually wanted from it and from their lives, about what had gone wrong and what could be different. They were not always comfortable conversations. She said things that were hard to hear, and he received them because they were true. He said things that he had held back for too long, confessions of his own fears and failings, and she received them with the direct, generous intelligence that was one of her finest qualities. He told her about the restlessness, the thing he had never named to her before, the old habit of motion that had been his whole life before her and that he had never fully examined. He told her he thought it came from a childhood spent moving, his father having been a man of the same constitution, always looking at the next county, always believing the thing he needed was just over the next rise. He told her that he had married her partly because she was the first person who had made him want to stop moving, and that he had then been confused and frightened by that wanting and had managed it badly. She was quiet for a long time after he said this. Then she said, "You could have told me that 3 years ago. I know, I would have understood it. I know that too. I was not ready to say it then. I am saying it now." She looked at him, and in her eyes was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was a process, not a moment, but something like the beginning of it, the decision to begin it. On the 3rd morning she came to the barn before he was fully awake and sat down on a bale of hay near where he was lying in the straw, and when he opened his eyes she was there in the pale early light looking at him with an expression he had not seen since their first year of marriage, something open and undefended and a little frightened by its own openness. "I want to go home," she said. He sat up slowly. "Our home?" he asked, needing to hear her say it clearly. "Our home," she said. "But Benjamin, I know." "You do not know what I was going to say. You were going to say that this is the last time, that if the same things happen again, there is no more riding across 4 states. A pause. "That is approximately what I was going to say. Then I know and I hear it, and you are right." She held his gaze for a long, serious moment. Then she said very quietly, "I missed you. Even when I was angrier than I knew how to say, I missed you every single day." He stood up from the straw, not caring what he looked like, and crossed the distance between them and took her face in his hands very gently and said, "I am not going anywhere. Not without you." She put her hands over his. Her eyes were bright. She did not cry, because Jane Norris Sutton was not a woman who cried easily, but her breathing was unsteady for just a moment. And then she leaned her forehead against his, and they stood like that in the cool, animal-warm air of the barn while the light outside grew and the horses stirred in their stalls. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was nothing like the first time, which had been full of newness and wonder, and it was everything like the first time, which had been full of the recognition that this was right. They told Clara and Thomas over breakfast. Clara embraced her sister for a long time without speaking and then pulled back and looked at her with searching eyes, and whatever she saw satisfied her, because she nodded once decisively and then turned to Benjamin and said, "You had better mean every word you said." "I do," he said. Thomas quietly offered his hand again. Benjamin shook it. They set out the next morning, Jane on Thomas's spare mare, a solid gray animal named Prudence that Thomas insisted she take, saying he had enough horses, and the gift was a small one given the distance. Benjamin tied the mare's lead to Cannonball's saddle ring for the first miles until they were clear of the Webb property, and then gave the lead to Jane, who did not need it, having ridden since childhood. They rode side by side through the pinon and juniper country south of Santa Fe, the mountains to the north catching the first snow of the season on their high peaks, white against the deep blue sky. The air was cold and clean and smelled of pine sap and the last of the autumn sage. They talked as they rode, and the talking was different from the 3 days at the Webb homestead. Those conversations had been necessary work, the kind of honest, difficult exchange required to clear ground that has become overgrown. This was different. This was the ease of 2 people who have said what needed saying and can now simply be together again, moving through a world that is full of interesting things. Jane told him about the journey from Texas, the stage from Harwood to San Antonio and then the longer stage west, the strange, suspended feeling of traveling alone for the first time in years, the way the landscape had shifted and the country had opened around her, and how she had been sad but also unexpectedly, guiltily exhilarated by the motion, by the sense of the world being wide. "I understand that feeling," Benjamin said. She glanced at him. "I know you do." "I think I understand it a little better now." They made camp the first night beside a creek in a wide valley, setting up with the practiced efficiency of people who know each other's habits. Benjamin built the fire and Jane made coffee, and they ate from the provisions he had restocked at a trading post 2 miles back from the Webb homestead. The night was cold, down into the 20s, and they spread their bedrolls close together near the fire and lay side by side under the clear sky looking at the stars. "When we get back," Jane said, "I want to add a room to the house." He looked over at her. "What kind of room?" "A proper sitting room with a good lamp and a bookshelf." She paused. "I have been reading more since I have had a quiet house to read in. I would like to be able to keep doing that." "Done," he said immediately. She turned her head to look at him. "Just like that." "I should have built it 3 years ago when you first mentioned it. You mentioned it at least twice, and I kept saying I would get to it." "You did keep saying that." "I should have gotten to it. We will build it before winter properly sets in." She turned back to the stars. After a moment she said, "I would also like a dog, a proper ranch dog, not just a hound that wanders." "That is also an easy yes." "You are agreeing to things very quickly." Because the things you are asking for are entirely reasonable and I have been slow about them. He paused. Is there anything else you want that I have been slow about? A long pause during which the fire crackled and a coyote called somewhere in the distance, its voice wavering upward. I want you to be home for supper, she said. Not every night. I know that is not always possible with the ranch, but most nights. Or if you cannot be, I want to know before you go that you cannot be. That is not a large thing to ask. No, she said quietly. It is not. He reached over and found her hand in the dark. The ride back to Texas took 8 days, somewhat longer than his outbound journey had been because they were riding together and not pushing the pace, stopping at reasonable hours and making camp properly. Benjamin found that he did not mind the slower tempo at all. The days had a rhythm that was complete in itself, the morning cold and the horse's breath making clouds in the air, and the coffee bitter and good, and then the long hours of riding through country that was different every day, the high desert of New Mexico gradually giving way to the drier, harsher landscape of West Texas, and then the long, slow descent toward the hill country. They stopped in a small town called Fredericksburg, 4 days into Texas, and slept in a proper hotel for the first time since leaving the Webb homestead. The hotel was a plain establishment but clean, with a dining room that served a beef and potato stew that was the finest thing Benjamin had eaten in nearly 2 weeks. Jane ate her portion, and most of his when he admitted he was full, and he watched her with pure fondness, the appetite she brought to a good meal being one of the small things about her that he loved without reservation. In Fredericksburg, they walked the main street in the evening, looking in the windows of the dry goods stores and the hardware merchant, and Jane stopped in front of a bookshop, which was an unusual amenity for a town of this size, and went inside with an expression of unconcealed pleasure. Benjamin followed her and spent a pleasant 45 minutes watching her work her way along the shelves with the focused joy of a person who has been away from books too long, and he bought her 3 volumes she selected, including a botanical field guide to the plants of the Southwest that she had been examining with visible longing. The proprietor, a small woman of about 60 named Mrs. Hartman, wrapped the books in brown paper and tied them with string, and Jane tucked the parcel under her arm with an expression of complete satisfaction that made Benjamin think that the bookshelf in the new sitting room needed to be a good one, sturdy and large, built for a growing collection. They rode into the yard of their hill country ranch on a clear, cold November afternoon, the sky brilliant blue above the cedar and live oak, the familiar smell of the place cedar smoke and dried grass and the good, honest smell of cattle from the lower pasture hitting Benjamin like something physical. Jane pulled up Prudence at the front gate and sat looking at the house for a moment. He watched her face. "It needs paint," she said. "It does." "Spring," she said. "Spring," he agreed. She dismounted, and he took both horses to the barn and unsaddled them and fed them. When he came back to the house, Jane had already started a fire in the kitchen hearth and the kettle was on, and she was standing in the middle of the kitchen looking around at the familiar, unchanged space with the expression of someone taking an inventory. "The room," she said, "off the east side of the parlor. There is room there if we extend out 8 feet. I will start drawing it up tomorrow," he said. She looked at him, checking his face for the half-hearted quality that had attended previous promises of this kind. She found nothing half-hearted in it, because there was nothing half-hearted in him about anything concerning her anymore. Whatever had required the long ride through 4 states to dislodge had been thoroughly dislodged. She put the tea on, and they sat at the kitchen table where 3 weeks ago he had read the note that had sent him west, and they drank their tea and talked about what needed doing on the ranch before winter set in. And Benjamin thought that this ordinary, warm, particular moment was what he had been riding toward without entirely knowing it. Not the dramatic reconciliation at the creek, though that had been necessary and true. Not the long, difficult conversations, though those had been necessary and true as well. Just this. Just being here in this kitchen with this woman, both of them present. He began the sitting room addition within the week. He had the carpentry skills for the framing, having built much of the original house himself, and he hired a man from the nearby settlement of Luling, a Mexican carpenter named Gregorio Salinas, to help with the more precise finish work. Gregorio was a precise and good-humored craftsman who worked with the economy of motion of the very skilled, and between them they had the frame up and roofed within 10 days, working in the thin, cold November sunlight, while Jane kept them supplied with coffee and cornbread at intervals. Jane herself was not idle during this period. She reopened the kitchen garden in preparation for a spring planting, cleaning out the spent summer growth and turning the soil with a purposeful energy. She wrote to her sister Clara and to her father Vernon, who was getting older now and whose letters had become more frequent and more affectionate, as if distance and time had softened the harder edges of the man. She began a correspondence with a woman in Bastrop who was organizing a small lending library, an enterprise Jane had been interested in supporting for years, but had never quite gotten around to formalizing. In the evenings, when the work was done and supper cleared away, they sat together, sometimes by the fire in the parlor, sometimes at the kitchen table with a lamp between them, Jane reading from one of her new books or writing letters, Benjamin working through the ranch accounts, or simply being still in a way that he had been unpracticed at before and was learning now. He found, to his genuine surprise, that he liked it, that the old restlessness, which had been partly a fear of stillness, of the silence in which all the things you have not dealt with make themselves known, was quieter than it had been. Because there was nothing he was avoiding any more. The things he had needed to say had been said. The things he had needed to change were changing. He was home. One evening in early December, sitting by the fire with the new sitting room just finished, and Jane's books arranged on the new shelf that Gregorio had built with a craftsman's pride, Benjamin looked across the room at Jane, who was reading with her feet tucked under her and the botanical field guide open on her lap, and said, out of no particular context but a great deal of feeling, "Thank you for letting me come after you." She looked up over the book. "You did not give me much choice about that." "You had a choice. You could have sent me away from that creek bank." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the steady, appraising gaze he loved. "I thought about it," she said honestly. "I stood there and I thought the reasonable thing to do is send him away and let this be clean." "What changed your mind?" "You were honest," she said. "You were genuinely, specifically honest in a way you had not been before, not just apologetic. You did not just say sorry and expect that to be enough. You told me the truth about yourself." She paused. "Also, you looked absolutely terrible after 6 days on the trail, which was, in a strange way, rather convincing." He laughed, a real one, the kind that startled itself out of him. She was smiling, fully, the real one, not the almost one, and it was the most beautiful thing in any of the 4 states he had ridden through. Christmas came quietly to the hill country ranch, the first proper Christmas they had spent at home in 2 years, Benjamin having been on the trail the previous December on a contract drive. Jane made the house into something festive with practical means, cedar boughs on the mantel and a wreath of dried berries on the door, and she made a Christmas supper that was extravagant by ranch standards, a roasted chicken and sweet potatoes, and a dried apple pie that made the house smell extraordinary for the entire afternoon. They exchanged small gifts. He gave her a new journal with a fine calfskin cover, blank, ready for whatever she wanted to put in it. She gave him a pair of riding gloves she had sewn herself from supple leather, fitted precisely to his hands, and he did not ask when she had found the time to make them or how long it had taken, because he understood that was not the point. In January, a man came by the ranch looking for a hand, or rather looking for work as a hand, a young fellow named Cody Marsh, 19 years old, lean as a rail and earnest, who had ridden down from the Panhandle looking for steady employment. He had good references and moved well around the horses, and Benjamin hired him after an afternoon of observation. Having Cody meant that the ranch could be worked more consistently, that Benjamin was not the single point of failure for every task that needed doing, and the difference in his available time was immediate and significant. He was home for supper. He was home in the mornings. He was present in the way that Jane had asked him to be. Spring came to the hill country with a wildness and beauty that the region was known for, the roadsides and fields exploding into bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, the live oaks putting out new leaves of a green so vivid it seemed almost phosphorescent. Jane's kitchen garden was planted and growing, and she had also put in a small flower garden along the east side of the new sitting room, visible through the window she had asked Gregorio to add on that side. It was in March, on a morning when the bluebonnets were at their fullest along the creek bank and the air smelled of rain and new growth, that Jane told Benjamin she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast, matter-of-factly, watching his face over her coffee cup. He set his fork down very carefully and looked at her and felt something enormous and clean and entirely unexpected moving through him. When? He managed. Late September, I think. Early October at the latest. He was across the table and kneeling beside her chair before he had consciously decided to move, taking her hands in both of his, and she laughed, that deep, surprised laugh that he would have crossed any desert to hear. "You are ridiculous," she said warmly. "I am very, very happy," he said. She looked down at him with her dark eyes full of something she did not have a name for, but that was rounder and more complete than anything she had felt in years. "So am I," she said simply. He painted the house that spring, as she had said, white, with green trim on the shutters, which had been her preference. Cody helped with the higher sections and was cheerful about the work, taking to the ranch with the enthusiasm of a young man who had finally found a place where he was genuinely useful. He was good with the cattle, better with the horses, and he had a kind of natural optimism that kept the mood around the place light and energetic. Jane's father Vernon made the journey from Bastrop in April, arriving by stage and then by hired wagon, older and somewhat slower than the last time Benjamin had seen him, but with the same sharp eyes and the same directness that Benjamin had always respected even when it had been aimed at him like a rifle. Vernon looked at the painted house and the new sitting room addition and the kitchen garden and the state of the ranch generally, and then he looked at his daughter and then at Benjamin with an expression that, for Vernon Norris, was practically effusive. "You have done all right," Vernon said, which was, from him, essentially a declaration. Benjamin accepted it as such. Vernon stayed 2 weeks. He and Jane spent long hours in the sitting room together, talking in the way that fathers and daughters sometimes finally talk when circumstances have made honesty possible, covering old ground and old misunderstandings and arriving, by what seemed to be mutual agreement, at a warmer and more honest understanding than they had had before. Benjamin gave them that space without question, understanding that it was not his ground to walk on. The summer was hot and long and full of work. Benjamin kept his cattle contracts local, refusing the far drives that would have taken him away for weeks, and the income was somewhat less than previous years but sufficient, and the ranch was producing better than it had when he was gone half the time and things fell behind. He thought about this with a satisfaction that had a quality of something corrected, something set right. Jane bloomed with the pregnancy in the most literal sense, her face and presence taking on a roundness and warmth that he would not have thought possible given that she had seemed to him already as warm and present as a person could be. She was not sentimental about the pregnancy, which was entirely in character. She was practical and curious about it, reading what information she could find, corresponding with the nearest midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Aguilar who lived 12 miles away and had attended more births in the hill country than she cared to count. On the first day of October, 1874, Benjamin and Jane Sutton's son was born in the bedroom of the hill country house, attended by Mrs. Aguilar and by Jane's friend from Bastrop, a woman named Harriet Cole who had ridden out for the occasion. It was a long labor and a hard one, and Benjamin spent most of it on the porch, which was where Mrs. Aguilar had firmly sent him, and he paced and drank cold coffee and talked to Cannonball, who was in the adjoining paddock and regarded him with calm, brown, philosophical eyes. When Mrs. Aguilar opened the door and told him to come in, he crossed the threshold and went to the bedroom and saw Jane propped against the pillows, exhausted and extraordinary, holding a small bundle of considerable noise, and something in his chest simply gave way. "Come see your son," Jane said, her voice rough with exhaustion but her eyes fully alive. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the face of their son, red and indignant and absolutely specific, already entirely himself, and he thought that everything that had led to this moment, the absences, the note, the cold kitchen, the 6 days of riding, the creek bank in New Mexico, all of it, had been the long, necessary road to arriving here, and that he would ride it all again without hesitation. "What do we call him?" he asked. Jane looked down at the baby's face thoughtfully. "I have been thinking about William," she said, "after your grandfather." Benjamin's grandfather, William Sutton, had been a farmer in Tennessee, a steady, quiet man who had worked the same land for 50 years and who had been, in Benjamin's childhood understanding of things, the one example he had of a man who put down roots and made them hold. It was a good name. "William," he said, testing it. It fit. They named him William Vernon Sutton, the middle name for Jane's father, which made Vernon Norris, when he was told by letter, write back a response that was 3 pages long and in places nearly illegible, which was the most emotionally expressive thing he had ever produced. The winter of 1874 passed softly, wrapped around a new shape of life. William was a substantial, good-natured baby who had his mother's eyes and his father's constitution for outdoor conditions, seemingly undisturbed by the cold and the wind that came off the hills in January. Jane managed the rhythms of new motherhood with her characteristic competence, asking for help when she needed it without embarrassment, and Benjamin was there to give it. He was there. That was the thing. He was there in the night when William woke and there in the mornings, when Jane was tired from the night and there, in the evenings sitting beside her in the sitting room while she nursed the baby, and the lamp burned and the fire was good. He was present in all the ways that he had not been, and the difference, which he had known intellectually would matter, turned out to matter in ways he had not fully anticipated. The days had a texture they had previously lacked. There was weight to them, density, the feeling of time fully inhabited. Clara and Thomas Webb made the journey from New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1875, riding south through country that was greening rapidly after a wet winter. Clara's own pregnancy showed clearly by the time they arrived, 6 months along, and she and Jane spent the week they were there in a state of practical, warm, entirely female solidarity that Benjamin and Thomas both found moving in a way neither of them commented on directly. Thomas walked the ranch with Benjamin and asked intelligent questions about the cattle operation, and told him about a boundary survey he had completed that winter that had produced some satisfying results for a Pueblo community whose land had been misrepresented in previous surveys, a correction that had required considerable bureaucratic persistence, but which Thomas spoke of with quiet satisfaction. They were good people, Clara and Thomas. Benjamin thought about how different his feelings about them had been on that first ride to New Mexico, when Clara had stood on her porch and sized him up with frank skepticism. He was glad she had done it. He was glad Thomas had given him that direct assessment on the porch that first evening. People who tell you the truth are worth keeping. Cody Marsh, the young ranch hand, had settled into the place in the way that some people settle, becoming part of the texture of it without ceremony. He had turned 20 that spring and had developed an affection for a girl in the nearby settlement, a blacksmith's daughter named Rosa Mendez, who came by the ranch occasionally with her father when the horses needed shoeing, and whose presence caused a noticeable improvement in Cody's grooming and general personal presentation. Benjamin said nothing about this, but Jane said quite a lot, in the best possible way, and invited Rosa to Sunday supper so consistently that the girl eventually stopped being shy about coming. By the summer of 1875, Benjamin Sutton was a man who came home every evening. He rode the cattle on the near range, and kept the books and managed the contracts, and hired the far drives out to younger men who were still in the phase of life where motion was what they needed. He sat on the porch at the end of the day with Jane beside him and William on the ground between them, learning the complicated physics of walking, and he looked at the hill country evening, the sky going gold and pink behind the cedar ridgeline, the cattle moving slow and dark in the lower pasture, and he felt the specific, earned quality of a man who has been somewhere far away and come back knowing what he came back to. He thought sometimes about the note. He still had it. He had not told Jane that he kept it, not from any secretiveness, but because there was something about keeping it that felt important, a reminder of the cost of what he had nearly lost. It lived folded inside the back cover of the ranch ledger, and occasionally when he opened the ledger and caught sight of it, he would unfold it and read it once and fold it back up, not with pain anymore, or at least not primarily with pain, but with the particular attention a man gives to something that taught him something he needed to know. One evening in late summer, sitting on the porch, William asleep inside and the evening choir of crickets starting up along the creek, Jane said out of nowhere, as she sometimes did, "Do you ever regret the ride?" He looked at her. "What kind of question is that?" "A genuine one. 6 days on horseback alone through hard country. You could have just accepted the note, started differently somewhere." "No," he said without needing to think about it. "No, you do not regret it." "No, I could not have just accepted the note. There was nothing to start differently somewhere because there is nowhere else I am supposed to be." He looked at the ridge. "And no, I do not regret the ride. Not a single mile of it." She was quiet for a moment, and then she leaned her head against his shoulder in a way she did sometimes in the evenings, a small, unceremonious gesture that meant more to him than speeches. "Good," she said softly. The years that followed built on each other the way good years do, each one adding something solid to the foundation of the ones before it. The ranch grew steadily, Benjamin adding acreage carefully when the right parcels came available, never overextending, always keeping within what he could manage without sacrificing his presence at home. Cody Marsh eventually married Rosa Mendez in a small ceremony at the Luling church that all four Suttons attended, William in his best clothes and deeply offended by the requirement to be still, and Benjamin and Jane danced at the reception with the ease of people who have been dancing together long enough to move without thinking about it. Clara gave birth to a daughter in October of 1875, and then to a son 2 years after that, and the correspondence between the two sisters was one of the constants of Jane's life, a thread of warmth and intelligent conversation that spanned the distance between Texas and New Mexico territory with reliable regularity. In the spring of 1877, Jane told Benjamin she was pregnant again. She told him over breakfast again in the same kitchen, and he set his fork down in exactly the same way as before, and she laughed the same surprised laugh, and he was across the table and kneeling beside her chair before he had consciously decided to move, and she said, "You are still ridiculous," and he said, "I am still very, very happy," and it was the same and completely different and entirely itself. Their second child was born in November of 1877, a girl this time, dark-haired and loud about her preferences from the first hour, whom they named Eleanor Jane Sutton, the middle name both honoring her mother and serving as a kind of private acknowledgement between them, a name that said, "This is where we are, Jane." William adored his sister immediately and with a wholehearted ferocity that was entirely characteristic. He was 3 years old and completely certain that Eleanor had been produced for his specific benefit, and took the responsibility of watching over her with a seriousness that was equal parts endearing and entertaining. Jane observed her son's big brotherhood with the fond, thoughtful expression of a woman who is watching something develop that she had a role in and was privately proud of. Vernon Norris made one more journey from Bastrop in the spring of 1878 to see his grandchildren. He was frail by then, the hard-edged hardware merchant worn thin by age, and he sat in the new sitting room with a leaner on his knee and William pressing close against his leg and told Jane, when Benjamin was briefly out of earshot, that she had made the right choice. Not just about coming back, but about everything. About the kind of woman she had been and the kind of home she had made and the kind of man she had decided her husband could become. Jane told Benjamin this later in the dark of their bedroom, and he was quiet for a long time. "That means a great deal to me," he said finally. "It should," she said. "He does not say things he does not mean." "No," Benjamin agreed. "He never did." Vernon Norris passed away the following winter peacefully in his house in Bastrop with Jane at his side. She came back from Bastrop quieter than usual and stayed quieter for a week or so, and Benjamin gave her that space and was there within it, present but not pressing. When she came back to herself, she was fully back, clear-eyed and settled, and she told him that her father had been at peace and that she was grateful she had been there. Life moved on with the particular forward motion that good lives have, not without difficulty, not without loss, but with an underlying current of the right direction. The ranch produced reliably. The children grew with the vitality of children who are securely loved. Benjamin Sutton became known in the county as a man whose word was completely good, who ran his operation honestly, who treated the Mexican families on the neighboring properties with the respect that was not universally common in the region, but that Jane had, from the earliest days of their marriage, held as a non-negotiable standard. On a September evening in 1879, their 9th wedding anniversary, Benjamin and Jane sat on the porch in the chairs they had brought out after supper, the children in bed and the ranch quiet around them, the same cedar ridge against the same evening sky, the same creek voice in the draw below. They had a bottle of wine that had come up from San Antonio, a small extravagance that Jane had suggested and which Benjamin had secured without comment. The glasses caught the last light. Benjamin looked at Jane, who was looking at the ridge with the expression she always had in these evening moments, half present and half somewhere else, thinking something, always thinking something. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She glanced over at him with a small smile. "I am thinking about the sitting room." "What about it?" "The bookshelf is nearly full." He looked at her. "Then we build another one," she laughed. "That is not a solution, Benjamin. That is an escalation." "Some escalations are worth it." She looked at him for a moment, and in the look was everything. The whole of the 9 years and the 2 children and the ride west and the creek bank in New Mexico and the empty kitchen with the note on the table and the cold ash in the hearth and all of it. Everything that had been hard and everything that had been good and the long, winding, instructive road between one and the other. "Yes," she said, "they are." He reached over and took her hand. She turned hers to meet his, a motion so habitual now it was almost unconscious, fingers fitting together the way things fit that have been in the same place long enough to leave an impression. The evening settled around them. The cattle moved in the lower pasture. Somewhere in the house William made a sound in his sleep, a brief murmur, and then was quiet again. Alina would sleep until morning, sound and emphatic about it, as she was about everything. The stars came out above the cedar ridge, the same stars he had looked up at from the bank of the Galisteo Creek with his heart in his throat and his horse resting, and the distance to Jane feeling like the largest thing he had ever had to cross. They were not large anymore. They were just stars, brilliant and close and present, arching over a house that was full of warmth and specific, hard-won happiness. He thought about the note, about riding west, about coming down off the mesa into the Rio Grande Valley and seeing the mountains to the north and knowing he was nearly there, about Cannonball's steady, faithful hooves on the caliche and the clay and the rock, covering the miles without complaint, carrying him toward the thing he was trying to save. He thought about Jane's face at the creek, the armor and the hope behind it. He thought about walking back to the house beside her. Worth it, he thought, all of it, every single mile. "Benjamin," Jane said. He looked at her. "Thank you for coming after me." He had waited years to hear her say that. He had not known he was waiting for it, but he had been. He lifted their joined hands and pressed her knuckles to his mouth for a moment, brief and certain. "Thank you for being worth coming after," he said. She shook her head slightly, the way she did when something moved her, and she did not want to be dramatic about it. They sat together on the porch in the good September dark, the wine in their glasses and the ranch around them and the children asleep inside. And they were home, both of them, completely and without reservation, home in every sense of the word. And the night was long and full of stars.